I guess, and the God-centered, Christ-centered nature of their life, that even after they're in the grave, their influence continues long beyond their physical life. Paul is regarded as the Gentile, or the apostle to the Gentiles, and if you look at church history, more people came to Christ during the Middle Ages by reading the writings of Paul than anything else. His influence on the Gentiles primarily continued long beyond his death, and so his influence was pretty great. Especially in the book of Romans, Martin Luther, John Wesley, they all recount how the reading of Romans was key to them coming to understand the gospel, justification by faith, and that sort of a thing. So we're now moving on to Acts 7. I want to look at the message that Stephen gives to the Sanhedrin in his defense. And first of all, this is Stephen's. I can't stand. I keep saying Steve. I'm getting too familiar. Stephen's apology. What's an apology? An apology isn't saying I'm sorry, but it's a defense. Apologetics. It comes from the Greek word apologia. Apologetics. It is a reasoned argument or writing in justification of something, typically a theory or a religious doctrine. So he is going to present probably one of the premier apologetical addresses to defend his faith. He's not only defending his faith, he's defending the Christian faith. He's defending the faith for his fellow believers, and really he gives us a pattern of defending the faith for us that we could also follow. So we are going to take the time. I want to take the time today to read. We're going to basically focus on Acts 7, 1 down through, I think, 53. I'm going to read through it once real quick, then we will come back and continue on here. And as you recall, Stephen has gone into the synagogue in verse 9 of 6, where he's contending with this group of Hellenized Jews, the Libertines, the Cyrenians, the Alexandrians, those of Cilicia and Asia, and they are not able to withstand his wisdom. He's full of the Holy Ghost. They cannot overcome his arguments. Therefore, they suborn men who tell lies and trumped up charges against Stephen. They grab Stephen and they take him before the Sanhedrin and to be charged falsely with various things. And so we pick it up in verse 1, where he's now standing before the Sanhedrin. And then said the high priest, "Are these things so?" And he said, "Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said unto him, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and come into the land which I shall show thee. Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Haran, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed into this land wherein ye now dwell. And he gave him no inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot on. Yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession, and to his seed after him, and when as yet he had no child. And God spake on this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage, and entreat them evil for 400 years. And the nation to whom they shall be in bondage will I judge, said God, and after that they shall come forth and serve me in this place. And he gave him the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham begat Isaac, and circumcised him the 8th day, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs. And the patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him, and delivered him out of all of his afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh the king of Egypt, and he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now there came a dearth over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and a great affliction, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was corn in Egypt, he sent our fathers first. And at the second time Joseph was made known to his brethren, and Joseph's kindred was made known unto Pharaoh. Then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred 75 souls. Now, some people say there's a discrepancy here, but I think he's also referring now to Joseph and his family. So there's and other locations in the Bible says 70. We're here looking at 75. So Jacob went down into Egypt, and he died, and our fathers. and were carried into Shechem and laid in the sepulchre that Abraham bought for a sum of money of the sons of Emor, the father of Shechem. But when the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose, which knew not Joseph. The same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our fathers, so that they cast out their young children, to the end they might not live. In which time Moses was born, and was exceeding fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up, and nourished him for her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him, that he was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, why are ye our brethren? Why do ye wrong one to another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? Wilt thou kill me as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. And when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord, in a flame of fire in a bush. When Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight, and as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses trembled and durst not behold. Then said the Lord to him, Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standest is holy ground. I have seen the affliction of my people, which is in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and am come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send thee into Egypt. This Moses, whom they refused, saying, Who made thee a judge and ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. And they brought them out after that he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt, and in the Red Sea, and in the wilderness 40 years. This is that Moses which said unto the children of Israel, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like unto me. Him shall ye hear. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel which spake to him in Mount Sinai with our fathers, who received the lively oracles given to us, to whom our fathers would not obey, but thrust him from them. And in their hearts turned back again into Egypt, saying unto Aaron, Make us gods to go before us, for as for this Moses, which brought us out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And they made a calf in those days, and offered sacrifice unto the idol, and rejoiced in the work of their own hands. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets, O ye house of Israel, ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness. Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. Our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness, as he had appointed, speaking unto Moses, that he should make it according to the fashion that he had seen, which also our fathers that came after brought in with Jesus into the possession of the Gentiles, which God drave out before the face of our fathers unto the days of David, who found favor before God and desired to find a tabernacle for the God of Jacob. But Solomon built him an house, howbeit the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands, as saith the prophet. Heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What house will you build me, saith the Lord, or what is the place of my rest? Hath not my hand made all these things? Ye stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, ye do always resist the Holy Ghost, as your fathers did, so do ye. Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? And they have slain them, which showed before of the coming of the just one, of whom ye have now been the betrayers and the murderers, who have received the law by the disposition of angels, and have not kept it. This is probably the longest recorded sermon in the Bible, and it is it's a very powerful sermon. And when I first got into it, I thought, well, how much can I tease out of this? I wasn't sure, but I ended up with quite a bit. So let's just take a look and see. First of all, this is Steve's apologetical defense of his faith. He has been accused of certain things. Let's see. The Bible tells us that we are called upon to be prepared not to just preach the gospel, but to defend our faith with reasoned argumentation. There are those who will claim that believers are we just are following fantasies, we're following fables. There's no reason for us to believe the things we believe, but there is. It's the natural conclusion of a logical and reasoned examination of the evidence and the facts that leads us to Christ. To me, and as you hear some of these testimonies, that we hear, that I've shown, one of the things you've heard them say most often is the most Jewish thing I could ever do is to believe in Yeshua. Why? Because they look at the evidence, they look at the facts, they read the Old Testament, they say, yes, Jesus was Messiah. The logical conclusion is Jesus is Messiah. And it's the same for us. You look at the evidence, and we logically conclude that Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world. We are sinners. He died for sinners, therefore He died for us. And it's simply a matter of faith and accepting what He has done. It is a matter of great logical conclusion. Being a believer is the most logical thing you can do. When you listen to the detractors and the Christ haters, their arguments are the most illogical I usually will ever hear. So, apologetics. In Acts 22:1, Paul talks about defending the gospel, and that's translated from the word apologia. Same in Philippians 1:7, translated again from the same word apologia, a defense of the faith. Jude 3 commands us to earnestly contend for the faith. Again, a reference to the fact that not only are we to believe and share the gospel, we also need to be prepared to contend for the faith, to defend our faith, and to provide an apologetical reasoning for why we believe what we believe. And so with Stephen, in his apologetical address to the Sanhedrin, he reasons with his accusers out of the Scripture. The Bible and the Old Testament Scripture is the foundation of his argument. So, the false witnesses brought 4 counts against Stephen that he is going to answer in this message. First, he's accused of having committed blasphemy against God. They also claim that he committed blasphemy against Moses, blasphemy against the law, and blasphemy against the temple. These 4 things. And these are the charges, and these are what Stephen attempts to address in his address to the Sanhedrin. Now, as I see it, Stephen's defense consists basically of 4. He's trying to accomplish 4 things when he is presenting his defense. First of all, he is going to present his defense in a way that will capture his audience's attention. What would be more? What would a Jewish group of people be more interested in than the history of their own race, the history of their people, the history of God? And so he couches his apologetical defense in a historical context and goes through the history of how God has dealt with the nation of Israel and how God has preserved and blessed Israel. And really, when we get down into it later, how they continually rejected God, turned their backs on God, disobeyed, and returned to idols. But he's using the historical context. He's using a topic which is going to draw their attention and keep them focused on what he's saying until he hits the main point. Secondly, he's going to defend himself against the charges of blasphemy. And he's going to go charge by charge. He's going to, first blasphemy against God, blasphemy against Moses, blasphemy against the law, and then blasphemy against the temple. So his address defends against these charges. Thirdly, his third objective in this defense is actually an indictment. He's going to indict them and the nation of Israel for their continual historical sinfulness. This message shows this, how they continually sinned and rebelled against God, and he's going to take that historical sinfulness, that indictment, and he's going to bring it up to the present time, and he's going to indict them, the people he's talking to, that you were just the same as those people were. You're no different. And then finally, he is going to present Messiah. He's going to present the Messiah to these people, and he's going to do it in a historical context, and he's going to show through the Old Testament how Messiah was Jesus Christ, and he had been predicted, and that they should have, if they really believed and understood the Old Testament scriptures, they should have recognized Messiah when he came. They did recognize Messiah when he came, but they didn't want him, basically is what happened. So, let's look at first, he captures their attention. He recites the history of God's dealing with the nation of Israel. And he begins by really going all the way back to when God called Abraham to Canaan. As I mentioned, the history of Israel is a topic near and dear to the heart of the audience. They're Israelis, they're Israelites. Their history is something they're very much interested in. And the history of the Jews is something that all of these men would have been, I mean, these are Jewish leaders, so the history of the Jewish people would have been very well known to all these people. It's not something they have no knowledge of. And his message is biblical. It's a biblical message. He quotes or paraphrases the Old Testament scriptures throughout his message. He either quotes directly or he paraphrases passages from the Old Testament. So, first, he's going to defend himself against the charge that he's blaspheming God. He starts by using the name, let's see if I can get it here. In Acts 1:2, he refers to God as the God of glory. And anyways, this is El Havakadam, I think was the Jewish word, and this was an all-encompassing name for God. It encompassed every aspect of God's character and nature. In you choosing this name, Stephen is basically saying to them, I believe in God. I believe in every aspect of His character. I am a believer in God. He begins with the story of Abraham. He invokes this name of God, El Hakavad, the God of glory, which invokes God's full character. Stephen declares, using this name, that he believes in every aspect of God. And then he shows that he believes in, not only does he believe in God, but he believes in the God of the covenant. He is showing them how God ordained and led Abraham. He believes in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Whenever God would appear to someone, he would often he would refer to himself, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm the God of the covenant. I'm the God who has made certain promises, which I intend to keep. So he believes in the God of the covenant, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the patriarchs. He also is, through this story, he is conveying to his audience that he also believes that the God of the covenant, the God of glory, has controlled and directed the destiny of Israel from the very first day. God has controlled everything, and he towards the completion and fulfillment of his promise. And then he recounts how the children of Israel went into bondage for more than 400 years. Even during that period of bondage, the God of glory was still directing her destiny. He was still in control, and he was preparing for the eventual fulfillment of the promise to Abraham that the land would be given to his people and his seed. Secondly, he has been charged with blasphemy against Moses in verses 17 through 42. But he goes back and he shows historically how Moses was chosen of God, chosen of the God of glory. He believes that the God of glory chose Moses. He believes that Moses was particularly chosen and ordained of God to lead the people. He also shows how the God of glory, the sovereign God, spared Moses. He spared him from the edict of the Pharaoh that all the male children to be thrown into the river, and God sovereignly intervened and spared Moses. He also shows how Moses was prepared by God to lead Israel by allowing him to be basically adopted into Pharaoh's home. He was found by Pharaoh's daughter and adopted into the house of Pharaoh, so he is legally, essentially, he is Pharaoh's grandson at this point. And he is raised and trained in the knowledge of the Egyptians at the time, which was considerable. The geometry, astronomy, these sort of things. He was prepared not only to be a leader of Israel to take them out of bondage, he also was prepared as one who would be able to stand in front of Pharaoh and demand the release of his people. He knew really how the Egyptians thought. Then he shows how Moses' heart was toward the Jewish people. The Bible tells us here in our passage that at the age of 40, he was inclined to go see his brethren. He wanted to see what was going on with the Israelites, and he had a heart for them, and that this was something that was, I think, placed in him by God again. And again, Stephen is showing these people how much he does revere Moses. He's not blaspheming Moses. He believes that Moses was God's special chosen servant, his special deliverer. And he shows his great admiration and respect for Moses by recognizing that he was God's man. Then they charge him with blasphemy against the law. Well, I'm sure that when he was originally arguing with the first group, he was probably saying things like Christ came to fulfill the law. Christ didn't come to do away with the law. And perhaps he was also castigating them for their perversions in tradition, how they used tradition to overshadow the law. So the tradition was what the thing they were all about, not so much the law itself. So in his account here, Stephen shows how the law was ordained of God. He believes that the law was God-given. There's no blasphemy there. He shows how the law was delivered to Moses. The man he had just declared as being God's ordained man was the one who was given the law by God. He is again showing his great respect for the law in that it was the product of God's revelation to Moses. He also shows that the law was intended for the benefit of the people. God didn't give the law to Israelites just to be a meanie. I mean, it was for the benefit of the people. The people, where people obey the law of God, they flourish. Where they don't flourish. So the law, he looks at the benefit of the law and explains to these accusers of him that he believes in the law. And then he charges them, or he is charged with blasphemy against the temple. Verses 44 to 47. And he goes back to the tabernacle. He says that the tabernacle was ordained and fashioned of God. The temple was a precursor, or the tabernacle was a precursor of the temple, and really represented the temple before the temple was built. Now, God never commanded David or Solomon to build a temple. It was in David's heart to do so. God condescended to agree to allow him to do it, and he told David, "You will not build it, your son Solomon will." But God never gave a command that the temple was to be built. So Solomon, not David, built the temple, and we see that although not commanded by God, it was sanctioned by God. And if you go back to 1 Kings 8, 10 to 11, after the dedication ceremony of the temple built by Solomon, we see that God's glory filled the temple. God moved in and condescended he basically was putting a stamp of approval on what Solomon had built. He didn't command Solomon to do it, but I think he was honoring the fact that Solomon's heart was in the right place when he built this temple. He wanted to honor the Lord with this temple. God came in, and his glory filled the temple, and he sanctioned what had been done. So now the indictment. He's seeking to indict these people, to basically charge them. What is an indictment in today's modern jurisprudence? It is an official complaint. It's an official complaint against somebody, laying out the crimes that they are charged with, and which becomes the basis for further prosecution. So, in spite of God's sovereign leading of the nation of Israel and his history of blessing her, Israel has continually blasphemed God. Not only that, Israel has continually blasphemed God in the very areas where Stephen was accused of blasphemy. They blasphemed God himself. They blasphemed Moses. They blasphemed the law, and they blasphemed the temple. They have a history of doing this. So Israel's blasphemy against God first. He shows in his historical account that Israel had a history of always rejecting God's ordained leaders. When a leader would make his appearance, the people rejected him. And in so rejecting him, they're rejecting God, because God ordained the leader. We have, he recounts Joseph, Moses, and he brings it forward to Christ. These three people he focuses on. Israel rejected these leaders, Joseph, Moses, and Christ. They were continually turning away from God to idols. And if you go back to Exodus 32:1, Moses is up on Mount Sinai receiving the law. And what do the people say to Aaron? We don't know what's happened to Moses. Up, let's make us gods and let's go back to Egypt. So they immediately blaspheme God by turning away from him to something they create with their own hands to worship, to lead them back to Egypt. So they themselves are blasphemers against God. It's historical. They continually do it. Up, make us gods that shall go before us. He also shows that they are blasphemous against their own law. Historically speaking, you go down through these various passages, and it tells how the people had contempt for the law, they broke the law, they did not follow the law, so they themselves have had a historical propensity to blaspheme the law. And he brings it forward, and he says presently, when I say presently, I mean at the time Stephen is making his address, at the time of Stephen and Jesus, they are blaspheming the law right now. How? By suborning false witnesses against the law to put Stephen to death and to put Christ to death. They violated their own law, which prohibited giving false testimony, and they used false testimony for their own selfish purposes. They themselves were blaspheming the law. They conspired to commit murder, which is against the law. They blaspheme the law by their conduct. They don't really believe the law. The law is just something they worship, but they don't really believe it and follow it. And then at the time of Christ and Stephen, they are worshiping things other than God. They're worshiping Moses, a man. They worship the temple rather than the God who it represents. These, again, were blasphemous against the law. God said, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And it's obvious that these people, in a sense, worship these things rather than worshiping God. If they truly worship God, they would have recognized Jesus Christ as their Messiah, and they didn't. So they have also a history of rejecting God and his prophets. Blasphemy against the temple. He shows again, historically speaking, the people of Israel have historically, continuously blasphemed the very temple that they claim they have such reverence for. First of all, like I said, God only commanded the building of the tabernacle. He did not command the building of the temple, but he conceded to David's desire to build the temple, which would eventually be built by Solomon. God sanctioned the temple built by Solomon by filling it with his glory. However, the Lord reminded them, I have no need of a house to dwell in. He is the creator of the universe. The earth is his footstool. He can't be put in a box, really. Isaiah 66:1-2 is where we see the reference that the heavens are my throne, the earth is my footstool. And then if you go back into Ezekiel 8, I want to go there for a bit. Ezekiel 8 is very interesting. It shows the degree to which the Israelites had profaned the temple. Okay, let's start with Ezekiel 8:8. Then said he unto me, Son of man, dig now in the wall. And when I had digged in the wall, behold a door. And he said unto me, Go in, and behold the wicked abominations that they do there. This is referring to the temple. So I went in and saw, and behold, every form of creeping thing, and abominable beast, and all the idols of the house of Israel were portrayed upon the wall round about. This is within the temple. And there stood before them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel, and in the midst of them stood Jehazaniah, the son of Shaphan, with every man his censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. The assumption here is that they're offering incense to strange gods in the temple. Then said he unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in his chambers of his imagery? For they say, The Lord seeth us not, and hath forsaken the earth. He said also unto me, Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations that they do. These are abominations they are doing in the temple. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz, Tammuz was the Babylonian false virgin-born son. It was a Babylonian god, and these women are in God's temple weeping for this false god. And he said unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations than these. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple, between the porch and the altar, were 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they worshiped the sun toward the east. So he is showing historically, Israel is the one that has historically, consistently profaned the temple. With what was going on here, this was an abomination to God, what was going on in his house. And the Israelites were guilty of it. So as we saw, the wall is adorned with images and creeping things. In this passage, women weeping for Tammuz, 25 men worshiping the sun, and 70 offering incense, presumably to other gods. And he shows, and if we look in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, these are all accounts of when Jesus goes in and cleanses the temple. We see that even at this day, at Jesus' day and Stephen's day, Israel continues to profane the temple. What did Jesus say in these four accounts? He says, my house was meant as a house of prayer, and you've turned it into a den of thieves. And they themselves were continuing to profane the temple by the actions that they took inside the temple. So these people were more concerned with worshiping the building rather than the God it represented. That was their thing. So now he's going to present Messiah to these people, and he's going to use Old Testament references to do so. Now, if we look, there are really two types of prophecy regarding to Messiah that Stephen is going to use. First, he uses what's called typical predictive. Those characters and persons in the Old Testament who are types of Christ. They show what Christ is going to be by the parallels of their life compared to that of Christ. And we see, typically speaking, and Stephen has very carefully chosen two men he's going to use for this, Joseph and Moses, to show how they were types of Christ. And being types of Christ, they were rejected by Israel. So he presents Joseph and Moses as types of Christ. Now let's look at this. First, Joseph. I spent some time on Joseph way back in when we started this history, showing how Joseph was a type of Christ. But let's look at it. Compare Joseph to Christ. First, Joseph is ordained by God. So was Christ. Joseph was rejected as a redeemer by his brethren. So was Christ. His brethren were moved with envy to sell him into slavery. Judas and the Israeli believers were moved with envy to betray Christ for a certain amount of money. Joseph was abased. He's put in prison. He's put in a pit, as was Christ. Christ was abased through death. And after he was rejected the first time, Joseph goes away. He's not seen again. The same with Jesus Christ. He is rejected by his people. He has gone away. He is not physically seen by the house of Israel. During Joseph's absence, there was famine. Right now, when Christ's absence, there is a spiritual famine in the house of Israel. And then we also see that Joseph married a Gentile bride. He married the daughter of Pharaoh. Christ is given a Gentile bride, which is the church. And then with this Gentile bride, Joseph raised up seed. He had two sons with his Gentile bride. Christ also is producing Gentile seed, the church, Gentile believers. We are the seeds of Christ. And we see that Joseph, he was eventually, he was exalted to second in the throne, second only to Pharaoh. The same with Christ. Christ is second in the throne, second only to God the Father. And then at his second appearing, when they see him the second time, he reveals himself to his brethren. Christ himself, the Bible tells us, is going to once again, at his second appearing, he's going to reveal himself to the people of Israel, and then they will accept him, to a man. And then after he had revealed himself to his brethren, he gave his brethren a place of rest. He brought them in and nourished them and succored them. Christ will also give his church a place of rest when all things are consummated. Something just happened here. All right, let's look at Moses. Same thing. He's presenting Moses as a type of Christ. Moses was ordained of God, so was Jesus Christ. Moses condescended to become a deliverer. Moses lived in the palace. He was in the palace of Pharaoh. He had everything a man could ever possibly want. He was willing to turn his back on that and step down and condescend to deliver the children of Israel from their bondage. Jesus Christ is the same thing, same way. He comes from the throne of God, the palace of heaven, and he is willing to set that aside and to humble himself and come to earth to be our deliverer. Moses offered himself as a deliverer to his people, as did Christ. Moses was rejected, as was Christ. Moses was treated as a criminal when they confronted him with the fact that he had murdered that man. Are you going to murder us too? Jesus was treated as a criminal at his trial. The righteous Son of God was treated as a criminal. Moses, after he is rejected, he goes away for a while. They don't see him. He goes to the backside of the desert for 40 years, to the land of Midian. Jesus Christ, again, he has been rejected by his people. He has gone away. They don't see him now. He's in another location. Moses married a Gentile wife. He married Zipporah. She was of Jethro, the Gentile. And he raised up seed with her, Gentile seed, as Christ raises up Gentile seed among the Gentiles with believers. Moses was a shepherd. Christ was a shepherd. Moses led his people out of bondage. Jesus leads, for those who are willing to accept him, he leads us out of a position of bondage where we're no longer slaves to sin. And Moses, he was accepted the second time he returned to his people as their leader. Jesus, again, will be accepted the second time he returns to Israel, and they will mourn for him that they pierced. Then we have the other type of prophecy is the verbal predictive, where it's actually stated about Christ. And he uses Moses primarily. Deuteronomy 18:15, 18:19, 18:19. Moses tells the people, another prophet like unto myself will arise after me, and him you will obey. To say, and he's really saying, to say one greater than Moses has arrived, Jesus, is not blasphemy, as he himself predicted it. So we have the final application, the present-day application at the time of this defense. He makes the application to the people that are accusing him. He says, Israel has been blessed by God from the beginning. Israel has historically turned from God. Israel has historically rejected those that God has sent. Israel blasphemed God, Moses, the law, and the temple on a regular basis. Those accusing of Stephen are guilty of the blood of Messiah. He turns it on him and says, you're just like your fathers. You're no different. You yourselves, you claim that if we had been back there, we would not have stoned the prophets. We would not have killed the prophets, but yet the Son of God came among you and you killed him. You would have killed the prophets. You are guilty for the blood of the prophets because you've killed the Son of God himself. So those accusing Stephen are guilty of the things that they have accused Stephen of, which is a common tactic, you know. It's a common tactic to deflect onto somebody else the things you yourself are guilty of. We see this in politics all the time. All the time. So that's that. Stephen has taken this message. He's broken it down. He's made it very logical. He's taken it, and with laser focus, he's zeroed it in on these men that are accusing him. He has cut them to the heart. They're really angry because he is. I'm sure that as he's going through this history, they're going, yeah, and finally he turns it on them, and all of a sudden they realize what he's been doing. And they're just furious and they're enraged. And so next week, we're going to look at the results of this fury and this rage and how Stephen meets his death at the hands of these wicked men, but yet it's a springboard for greater things. Are there any questions or comments on what we've looked at so far? All right. If you're interested in studying Christian apologetics, I think Stephen's sermon is a good place to start. Thank you, gentlemen.